but starting to record. And I think we'll get going. Let me do this. I'm going to share this up. And I'm actually on my daughter's computer today, so I am hopefully I'm on her Wi-Fi, so two things going on here today that hopefully will remain solid. But then again, I don't always have the best Wi-Fi, so maybe my Wi-Fi will be better today. It's usually fine Tuesdays. It's Wednesdays. It's the evenings that it sometimes doesn't work well. So yeah, so hopefully, let me just get us on Facebook as well. Sometimes we have a text that everybody knows, and when you read it in the Midrash, you realize you maybe didn't know the whole story, or you see parts of this that you didn't know could happen. Oh wait, give me 1 second. I'm putting it on Facebook. So we are going to go on because people are watching us right now on. Well, that's going to, why aren't we on Facebook? So put us on. And a few people actually text this morning that people are not going to be here, but and we are up. All right. So with all that buildup, let me get to what we're actually looking at. And the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at the tabernacle, the construction, the installation of the priests, the big buildup for what's going to be the new way that people are going to be talking to God. When I say the new way, at least the way the Bible perceives it in Leviticus, this is a big honor to be able to have the Mishkan, a huge honor. I mean, it's a huge special thing the Jewish people have. It's a big thing for God because God has a home here on earth now that we're in charge of. And the priests, in particular, Aaron and his family, get to initiate this. And so this is the end of Exodus and the beginning of Leviticus in the Torah. But what's interesting about Leviticus that we have talked about before is that most of Leviticus is not narrative. When I say most, meaning 99% of it. So the only parts of Leviticus that are really narrative are chapter 10 and a little bit from chapter 24. And both of those narratives are not in-depth narratives and are basically like little stories to kind of explain how the priests and Israel kind of have to atone and figure out, almost make the case for why Leviticus is so important, why the temple is so important. And so today, right now, today, if you don't blink, you're going to miss the only midrash that is collected in Ginsburg's book. Meaning, right now we're going to be reading a midrash on Leviticus, and then we're not. Like in a few moments, we're going to be reading in Numbers. That's it. Like literally, when I tell you in a few minutes, 20 minutes, there's no more Leviticus. That doesn't mean there's not Midrash written on Leviticus. There is a whole section of Midrash Rabbah collection that goes back a very long time. There's Midrash from the Talmud that's based on Leviticus, but it's based on lines, it's based on words, it's based on concepts. It's not based on a story. And most of the really vibrant Midrash, and definitely the Midrash that Ginsburg was interested in, that most of us are interested in because it's a Midrash on the narrative, it's explanations and fills in the blanks on the narrative, it doesn't exist. There isn't any because there's no narrative. So there's no launching point from which to write stories because it doesn't exist. So that's why what we read today is so unusual. Well, I was kind of hoping we'd have some more people too, just because when I tell you that we're reading about Leviticus today, I mean, this is it. So last week we had a little bit from Leviticus. It had to do with the tabernacle construction. And so, I mean, this section here that we read last week was kind of based on Aaron being selected and the week of training, that first week. This story begins on Yom Shmini, and it's from Parshat called Shmini. That happened on the 8th day when Nadav and Avihu come forward to offer up their sacrifices. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rosemary. If you would read us the interrupted joy.
The happiest of women on this day was Elisheva, daughter of Aminadab, for beside the general rejoicing at the dedication of the sanctuary, 5 particular joys fell to her lot. Her husband, Aaron, was high priest. Her brother-in-law, Moses, king. Her son, Eleazar, head of the priests. Her grandson, Phinehas, priest of war. And her brother, Nashon, prince of his tribe. But how soon was her joy turned to grief. Her 2 sons, Nadav and Abihu, carried away by the universal rejoicing at the heavenly fire, approached the sanctuary with the censers in their hands to increase God's love for Israel through this act of sacrifice, but paid with their lives for this offering. From the Holy of Holies issued 2 flames of fire, as thin as threads, then parted into 4, and 2 each pierced the nostrils of Nadav and Abihu, whose souls were burnt, though no external injury was visible.
So really important texts. And there are a few things to digest in this. The first, of course, I guess you could say that this Midrash has us focus on a woman, and a woman that we really know nothing about. I mean, literally, not, we know a little bit about Zipporah, about Moses' wife. We know she's a Midianite. We know a little bit about her dad. We don't know anything about Elisheva. What's interesting, of course, is that according to tradition, she is the daughter of Aminadab, who's also the father of Nachshon from the tribe of Judah. So what's interesting about Aaron's sons is that essentially on 2 lines, they're really special because they have the Levites through their father, and the Levites, meaning like literally they are the Levites who were chosen to be the special Levites. And on their mom's side, they are connected to Judah, to the tribe of King David. So they have very special genealogy. And so what's interesting about this, by telling it through her side, they're kind of acknowledging that this woman who was really, really lucky, I mean, really this woman who had everything, actually, it has so much to celebrate. I mean, literally celebrate because her brother's a prince, her kids, her her husband, her brother-in-law, all these people are having these great experiences, and she's this woman who gets to be there for all this stuff. And yet it turns to terrible tragedy because she loses two of her sons in an instant. And it's kind of a reminder that sometimes our best days turn to tragedy, and people who have wonderful lives and people who have seem like everything's going for them can have it all taken away. And again, you can talk about the Kennedys and people who have these things and then they seem cursed. There are those things too. This is a little different from the standpoint of we don't know that the rest of her life is cursed, but this day that should have been this day of celebration and great joy for her turns to one of the most horrific days of her life. So what's this woman really going to remember from this time when her husband is at the pinnacle of his job? Her kids are going to be heroes, and her grandson Pinchas, as we're going to read actually in this week's Torah portion, the grandson through Eleazar is he's the special priest that now, not just as a parent, but as a grandparent, that the family is going to continue. This is what she should remember. It's not what she's going to remember. It's the death of her sons. So, there is not much description in the Midrash here about what actually happens when Nadav and Avihu get burned up. And to the contrary of what you might expect, at least in one version of the Midrash, it wasn't a dramatic situation. On the contrary, this Midrash actually tells us no one would have even known what happened. Couldn't tell. It says that the fire that came forward was as thin as thread. Which is pretty spooky too, if you think about it. But the fact that Nadav and Avihu were burned up, their souls were burned up, or their body internally is burned up, but you couldn't tell. So the idea that they exploded, that they melted, that they blew up like Raiders of the Lost Ark, at least the Midrash doesn't have that. At least this Midrash doesn't have it. And it doesn't seem to be the plain meaning of the text about them being burned. And so they went kind of out of their ways, the writers of this Midrash, to give us this idea that it's not as dramatic and it's not as brutal and graphic and visual as you would have thought, which kind of tells us that the rabbis didn't like the idea of them blowing up in a big and very visible way. Didn't at least feel that that was necessary for it to happen. And you see another trend that you're going to see in the next few paragraphs, that their death, there is a tradition or there's a line of thought, was necessary. This is a crazy idea.
The death of these priests was not, however, unmerited, for in spite of their piety, they had committed many a sin. Even at Sinai, they had not conducted themselves properly. For instead of following the example of Moses, who had turned his face away from the divine vision in the burning bush. They basked in the divine vision of Mount Sinai. Their fate had even been decreed, but God did not want to darken the joy of the Torah by their death. Hence, he waited for the dedication of the tabernacle. On this occasion, God acted like the king who, discovering on the day of his daughter's wedding that the best man was guilty of a deadly sin, said, "If I cause the best man to be executed on the spot, I shall cast a shadow on my daughter's joy. I will rather have him executed on my day of gladness than on hers." God inflicted the penalty upon Nadav and Abihu in the day of gladness of his heart, and not on the day on which the Torah espoused Israel.
Yeah. So this is a really important text that has a whole bunch in it too. So let's talk about what we just read. The first is, why did they get killed? Why did God have to kill them? Was it warranted? And so we have this tradition that, yes, it was warranted, and it wasn't a one-time thing. That these guys had a problem, which is that they liked being around the divine presence so much that they did things that even Moses wouldn't do when it came to being in the presence of the divine. And so they have a track record. They have a history of it. So they establish that it goes all the way back to Mount Sinai when these guys would start doing stuff like this. That's one possibility. We're going to see another one coming up of what was going on. Where did it come from? I think it's important just to take a moment, which I shall do right now, to show you actually what the Torah says about this. So let's just take a quick look from Leviticus chapter 10. 1 second, that didn't work. Hold it. So here's the text, and it's it. There's 2 verses. Aaron's sons Nadav and Abihu each took his fire pan, put his fire on it, and it laid incense on it, and they offered before the Lord alien fire, which he, God, had not enjoined upon them. And fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them. Thus they died at the instance of the Lord. That's all it says. There's not much to go on from that in the Torah. Then we have Moses telling Aaron, this is what the Lord meant when he said, through those near to me, I will show myself holy and gain glory before all the people. And Aaron was silent. And so it seems like Moses sets up this idea that there is a need for this to happen from the standpoint of that God is telling, or Moses is telling people that when we're going to talk to God, something special is going to happen. Something powerful is going to happen. And I'm going to demonstrate how powerful this is by showing you what happens when it's not done right. And so there's this idea, there's a kernel of an idea here in the Torah, which the rabbis develop, which is that they're made examples of and are martyrs. And it had to happen. And so as bad as this was, it was necessary. As tragic as it was necessary. And maybe it's an example of what happens when leaders essentially have to prove to everybody else through their life, and in some cases their death, And this is really this concept that we have of martyrdom, which, as we know from the rabbis and from the period of time that many of these texts were written, martyrdom was kind of commonplace. And I know that seems strange because thankfully we don't live in a time like this. But there were days when rabbis were literally saying, you know what, today, I wake up today and I'm going to do something that's going to cause me to be killed by the Romans so that everybody else will know what Jewish tradition is and how important it is. And I'm going to lay down my life today to remind people of that. And if I don't do it, then the people will stop being Jewish. And so what I have to do in order to do my job today is make a statement. Now, there are discussions in the Talmud of whether that type of behavior is acceptable or not, or under what circumstances it's acceptable. But all that tells us is that it was fairly common. And it's sometimes way too common that people had to do this. And so there is this sense, either knowingly or unknowingly, that Nadav and Avihu step up into this role of being martyrs, in which case what they do is not really so much an act of evil or disrespect or negligence, but one of martyrdom, one of absolute sacrifice. So again, there is a tendency in the rabbinic mind to reframe this story of Nadav and Avihu from that standpoint. Now, there's the other tendency, which is that Nadav and Avihu were not good people and were engaging in this kind of stuff for a long time. And that that God is going to punish them. And what does God do? I love this analogy in this little mini parable that the rabbis throw out. What is it compared to? It's compared to a king who doesn't want to ruin the day for his daughter. What do you think of when you read that midrash? Anybody have any? I tell you what I think of, but I want to see if anybody feels the same thing. Anybody? Tell me what that mashal, what that parable sounds a lot like. If I cause the best man to be executed on the day of my daughter's joy. No? One of the great scenes in any movie ever. One of the greatest movies of all time. No? Nobody?
Not ringing a bell.
Marlon Brando? You come to me on the day that my daughter is to be married?
Is this Godfather or something? I never watched those movies.
Yes. The line is from The Godfather. It's one of the classic lines of the movie. You come to me on the day that my daughter's to be married, but on the day of my daughter's wedding. You come to me on the day of my daughter's to be married. So a guy comes to The Godfather to ask for a favor, and the point is that, of course, he gives him he's going to put him through the ringer, but the point of what he says is that you're asking me for a favor on this day that that I'm celebrating with my daughter. So this is very Godfather-esque to some extent too, but it's showing God's mercy. It's saying that God didn't want to turn one of his days into a day of sadness. Was willing to do his day, but not his son's day or daughter's day. The day that was our great day was when we got the Torah. The day of God's great day was getting the Mishkan, dedicating the Mishkan. Now, why did it have to be one of those 2 days? That's a really good question. Why do you have to kill these two guys who maybe deserve it on this day? And so on a big day, those days, but they need to make a statement, right? And so when the people are all gathered together for the Torah, and Nadav and Abihu behave in a bad way and want to be in the divine presence more than they should, God lets it pass. But when they do the same thing on the day of the dedication of the temple, God says, I'll sacrifice my great day by doing this. Now, again, there's a certain power here that God exerts in this, which is scary. Quite frankly, it's scary. But he does it. They're killed. And to some extent, it was already in the cards. It was already going to happen from what they did at Mount Sinai. So that's why it happened at that moment. All right. But again, we're going to think about maybe other reasons why this had to happen.
Among the sins for which they had to atone was their great pride, which was expressed in several ways. They did not marry because they considered no woman good enough for them, saying, our father's brother is king, our father is high priest, our mother's brother is prince of his tribe, and we are heads of the priests. What woman is worthy of us? And many a woman remained unwed, waiting for these youths to woo her. In their pride, they even went so far in sinful thoughts as to wish for the time when Moses and Aaron should die, and they would have the guidance of the people in their hands.
Okay, let's pause right there for just a quick sec. So according to this Midrash, it's not just the fact they offered up an alien fire, which is all the Torah calls it, an alien fire. A unsanctioned fire, a fire that doesn't belong, whatever you want to call it. The word zara is foreign or alien. It's not in the right place. It doesn't even say it's the wrong thing. It's just the wrong place. It was not, it wasn't the right thing in that place. But the rabbis searched for other reasons or at least what's going wrong in their lives. Why are they like this? So we just read two kind of quick, but let me talk about just for a second about the first one, which is really interesting. We don't know that Nadav and Abihu were not married. It doesn't say that they were, and it doesn't give any family members that come out of them. So the assumption was that they didn't have kids. And so the rabbis developed that. And they developed this as an idea of what does that say about them? And it says that they are prideful and arrogant. And one of the ways that we know that is because they refused to be married. And there were women waiting for them. There were women that literally should have been married to them. And so they were sitting there waiting for them to be married to them and were being taken out of the marriage pool, which seems less, to me, a little less about them and more on these women who only wanted to marry them. But regardless, this was a sin. So it kind of tells us, though, a very important idea in Judaism, which is that if you didn't get married, if you took that route, some people would feel that it was an expression of arrogance and that you were better than everybody else and that you were taking yourselves out of the gene pool to some extent. And that was not considered to be good behavior. Does anybody want to know what I'm kind of getting at here?
Well, we don't think there's anything particularly holy about celibacy.
Yeah, which now take that to the next level.
As in for priests.
For priests and also particularly for interestingly, for the group of people even before that, I guess, who take priesthood and take celibacy as part of their ritual, which are, or their lives, I'm saying ritual, their lives. The Catholic,
Like the Catholic Church.
early Christians. But I would venture to say that this is actually another statement about, to some extent, about this tendency, to use that word, or there's other words for it too, but for Jesus. Because one of the knocks about Jesus that we know would have been raised during Jesus' own life was the fact that, at least from what we read in the Christian Bible, what the Christians tell us, is that he's not married and doesn't have kids. And so what does Jesus' life, and specifically, what would his life, and again, it could be that he was married, it could be that he had kids. Christian Bible didn't want to talk about it. I don't want to get into Da Vinci Code stuff. It's not the purpose of the Gospels to talk about the family members of the disciples and of Jesus. And as a matter of fact, it's anti-family in many ways. We talked about that before when we looked at the Gospels years back in this very time slot. So it's consistent, but of course it's not a Jewish tradition and it's not a Jewish value, and it's not something Jews would have bragged about for anybody, including these first priests. Nadav and Avihu are the older sons of Aaron. They're the ones that the priesthood should have continued with. And yet it can't, and it won't. And at least part of that is because of who they were and what their values were and the way they behaved. And so Judaism is essentially saying that our holiest people, our priests in those days, need to be married in order to function as leaders. And we would say that, again, by extension, other traditions that don't do that, we kind of call into question, what is it that you're saying? That you're holier than other people because of your job? Again, that goes for other religions, and it also goes for within Judaism, whether rabbis who would go into the rabbinic tradition and were ordained as rabbis, the idea that they had to be married was not just implied, it would have been very difficult for a rabbi to be considered a rabbi if they didn't have a family, if they weren't married. It didn't mean that they had to have children. Some people didn't have children and couldn't have children and didn't, if there were no children, that wasn't a requirement, but to be married was. And it doesn't say you must be married in order to be a rabbi. Nobody said that. But the implication from the text, the work that rabbis made, well, the message that rabbis gave to their students, to their disciples, that they had to be married was very clear. And would they have looked at a rabbinic student who didn't look like they wanted to be married, would they have encouraged that person to do it? So there's a very interesting, self-selection process. There's a selection process, if you will, too, because essentially if somebody was about to be made a rabbi and they said to their student, I'm talking about 2,000 years ago, hey, are you going to be married? Do you have a betrothed? Are you going to be married soon? If the student had said something like, I have no intention of being married, it's very possible that his teachers would have said, you know what, you're not ready to be a rabbi, or you're not going to be a rabbi. So it's very possible that was, again, not implied, but actually enforced by the rabbinic authorities from the previous generation. So this is part of what are the decisions that are being made. There are no requirements today for rabbis to be married. I will say that in the Orthodox movement, it would be virtually unheard of for a rabbi not to be married, no matter how holy or pious a person was. If they weren't married, they probably wouldn't be respected by the community and given authority. There are very few cases of rabbis that were not married throughout the last 2,000 years. I mean, there's stories of people being widowed, losing their family, losing their children, losing their spouses, but not being married in the first place. And I would say today, in the Reform and conservative Reconstructionist movements and the more progressive movements, one of the things that would be done, that is done for all rabbinic students, and again, within the seminaries, if you get married, if you get ordained through a mail order system, they're not going to do this. But if you go through any of the rabbinical seminaries, there is a psychological evaluation. And one of the things that people will ask during those evaluations are, what type of relationships do you have? What type of relationships are you in? And again, while obviously there are rabbis who are ordained today that are gay, lesbian, have lots of different types of relationships that, at least by biblical standards, rabbinic standards, traditionally were not the norm, to put it mildly. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't ordain somebody who was in a again, whatever type of relationship that somebody said was maybe 30 years ago not acceptable or rabbinate. They want to know that the person's in a relationship or capable of being in a relationship, open to being in a relationship. So Nadav and Avihu seem to have this fundamental sense of pride and arrogance that does not allow them to feel that any woman is worthy of them. And by nature, of course, that extends to their attitude in general about who they are. So that's one big thing. The other thing that Rosemary just read, which is tremendous from some standpoint, is that Nadav and Avihu actually were waiting for Moses and Aaron to die. They were longing for them to die, thinking that they're going to be taking over when they die. It's really, really arrogant and really quite nasty. So these are the traditions. And again, Nadav and Avihu are worse than we even know. So God's going to teach them a lesson, because we read another little, this isn't so much a parable, but a saying, a proverb, or a idiomatic expression. Here's the idiomatic expression.
But God said, boast not of yourself of tomorrow. Many a colt has died, and his hide has been used as cover for his mother's back.
So let's just, what is that? What is that? What kind of phrase is that? That's kind of scary. But yes, don't be prideful. Don't talk about what you're going to have tomorrow. Don't think you're worthy of things, and that only good things are going to happen to you. Yeah, there's this phrase we have that there's a lot of horses that think they're going to be a big deal, big shot, but they wind up being a saddle. That's kind of crazy.
Right. It's kind of saying, you think you're going to inherit your mother's stuff, but you're going to be part of your mother's stuff.
Yep. Yeah. Well, yes, that you're not going to inherit. Yeah, you won't be there to inherit anything.
Right.
You wind up exactly. Your stuff might be part of her stuff.
Right.
And that does happen.
Totally.
There are situations where, parents, oftentimes mothers, outlive their kids whose inheritance they think they're getting, and winds up being the mother's property. So yes, it is a strange phrase, one that we don't use anymore, but it happened enough that there's a phrase for it, that people knew it. And so Nadav and Avihu wind up being examples of that phrase. Don't Don't spend your parents' money before they go. And of course, there are people who try to do that and wind up killing their parents or trying to kill their parents, which is definitely, if not the worst thing a kid can do, it's got to be up there as kids. So it happened. It happens. You can watch Dateline. Every so often, there's a story on that, or American Greed. But yeah, if they're in that mentality, how can Moses and Aaron ever sleep at night, knowing that they're back there? And by the way, whenever you have any type of situation where family power, authority is inherited, you're going to have this. And I can't tell you how many dynasties throughout history, because it's incalculable how many kids killed their fathers in order to take power. It just happens so much, and the system essentially was encouraged that by saying that, yeah, the only way you can inherit, the only way you can take power is by your father dying, and some really kind of not good people saying, oh, I'll make that happen a little quicker. So that's pretty scary that maybe Nadav and Avihu were of that type of mentality, that they would have done anything to take power from their father. And so that's a really, really scary thing. All right, that's a couple. That's two things so far.
Even in the performance of the act that brought death upon them, did they show their pride, for they asked permission of neither Moses nor Aaron whether they might take part in this sacrificial service. What is more, Nadav and Abihu did not even consult with each other before starting out on this fatal deed. They performed it independently of each other. Had they previously taken counsel together, or had they asked their father and their uncle, very likely they would never have offered the disastrous sacrifice, for they were neither in a proper condition for making an offering, nor was their offering appropriate. They partook of wine before entering the sanctuary, which is forbidden to priests. They did not wear the prescribed priestly robes, and furthermore, they had not sanctified themselves with water out of the laver for washing. They made their offering, moreover, in the Holy of Holies, to which admittance had been prohibited, and used strange fire, and the offering was all in all out of place, because they had no command from God to offer up incense at that time. Apart from this list of sins, however, they were very pious men, and their death grieved God more than their father Aaron, not only because it grieves God to see a pious father lose his sons, but because they actually were worthy and pious youths.
So again, if you think what's going on here, how can they say both things? It's because we have different midrashim, we have different traditions, we have different lines of reasoning about who they were and whether their act was more of an act of martyrdom, or whether their act was consistent with their behavior and their punishment long overdue. So we have two very different traditions about Nadav and Avihu, which seem to be conflicting, difficult to rationalize and to have both of those things be true. But it is an interesting idea, or both sides of this are interesting ideas, which again, the rabbis will develop out. So we just read some other things that they did wrong, or about who they were, but their character flaws. So they didn't consult anybody, which would go along the lines of they just acted on their own impulsively. And what's interesting about this is this midrash even goes so far as to say they didn't even consult each other. Both of them came out independently to do this bad stuff. And if they had actually seen or talked about it ahead of time, they wouldn't have done it. They would have said, "Oh yeah, this is a bad idea." So that's what happens. There's nobody grasping them and going, "This is a bad idea." So they did it secretly, and they did it secretly. Even they concealed from each other what they were about to do. So interestingly, there's kind of like a little mini lesson here, which I think is really good, which is that sometimes when you make a mistake and someone else is making the same mistake, that if you both knew that you were going to make the same mistake, that you would help each other from making that mistake. Uh, and it happens. It happens with siblings sometimes. It happens with, which this is obviously a case of siblings, but it happens with friends. Um, it happens that, uh, sometimes if your friend or your sibling makes the mistake before you do, you learn from it. You go, "Oh, okay, I'm never doing that." Um, and and sometimes just hearing that the person's doing it is enough to get you to say, "Oh, that's a really dumb idea." So it kind of teaches us that some ideas are really dumb, and if we saw it or heard about it ahead of time, even before we did it, we'd go, "Oh yeah, that's dumb." So there's that, which is when you do something silly and stupid and dangerous and you don't talk to anybody about it, that compounds the problem because talking about it ahead of time might stop it from happening. And so the deceitfulness aspect of this too, um, is compounds and makes it worse. So there's that interesting idea here, which I think is definitely a true statement, which is sometimes all we need to do in order to not make the mistake is talk about it ahead of time, run it past somebody, and let somebody say to us, "Oh, that's really a bad idea." Now, again, sometimes that doesn't stop us. Sometimes it does. Sometimes merely the person saying to you, "Did you think about this?" And then you go, "Oh, yeah, yeah, that's a dumb idea." And so if we don't tell people what we're going to do, if we're prideful about it, if we're deceitful about it, um, it makes it worse. And sometimes, again, it makes it wouldn't have happened otherwise. So that's another thing that Nadav and Abihu do. That's not good and indicative of their pride and their character flaws. It's also important that the Midrash here tells us that they were drinking alcohol when they did it. Where do we get this? Where do we get this idea that they were drunk? Anybody remember? Let's go back to the text real quick. Moses said to Aaron, "This is what God said," and then we have the cleanup of this, which we're going to read about the midrash on that. And then in verse 9, it says, "Drink no wine or other intoxicant, you or your sons, when you enter the tent to me, that you may not die. This is a law for all time, throughout the ages, for you must distinguish between the sacred and profane, and between the unclean and the clean, and you must teach the Israelites all the laws which the Lord has imparted through Moses." Why does it have that? Where does that come from? God, that seems to be a strange place to impart a lesson about intoxicants for the priests. It doesn't say priests can't drink. It doesn't say that at all. On the contrary, they're allowed to drink. Judaism has lots of times when people drink. Unless you're a Nazarite, drinking isn't off limits. Alcohol. But not when you're doing priesthood stuff, not when you're doing your job. Because priests need to be 100% on the ball. When they do their job, they must know what they're doing, what's clean and what's not clean, which cow is fit for the sacrifice, how to do the sacrifice. How many times do I toss I'm supposed to toss blood 7 times. I lost count. You got to be at you have to be at your full potential. You have to not diminish yourself at all through alcohol, your cognitive abilities. So this is a really important law in the Torah. We get it right after. And so the rabbis derive from the juxtaposition where it is there and where it is there. A couple of verses later, they're connected. God is teaching us, don't be like Nadav and Abihu who were drinking before. Now, I will say, as we read that priests were not supposed to drink when they were doing their priestly stuff. And the rabbis derive from that rabbis are also likewise not supposed to drink when they're on the job, with the exception of maybe Simchas Torah and Purim, where you're supposed to have a good time during the ritual, during the celebration, which everybody, again, knows are the kind of exceptions to the rule. But it definitely is something that is a serious issue, which is that rabbi, a cantor, people who are leading people in services are not supposed to be under the influence when they're doing it. Does it happen? Yes. Should it happen? No. Is there potential for rabbis and cantors to lose their job if they're under the influence when they're doing their job? Absolutely. And it happens, not a lot, but it happens, and it's happened, and it will continue to happen. People, being people, will make really bad decisions about alcohol and drugs, intoxicants. So it says other intoxicants. When you look at those kinds of things, people will say, we can't have people under the influence when they are leading a community, leading in prayer, doing the equivalent of what priests did thousands of years ago. Now, by the way, this is one of the reasons why I won't even drink wine before services. When we had happy hour the other day, I had only alcohol after we were done with services. I don't really drink at all. I don't even drink wine at Shabbat dinner before services. It's a serious issue for me to not have any type of anything that's going to influence me during services that was created by an intoxicant. Look, there's an issue here that I think is important now, that's relevant today, that wasn't relevant 10 years ago. And maybe it was relevant before, but we don't have a lot of discussions about it. But what happens when people need medication or drugs in order to maintain an even keel, when they don't have an attack of anxiety or Tourette's? And so what is that gray area between what would somebody need in order to function? And again, no one would say, well, if a person needed to function, he needs to have a few drinks before services. Most people would laugh at that and say, that's ridiculous. But if people are taking, and I'm using this in all seriousness, if people are using medical marijuana, if they're using THC, and they're using it because they have anxiety or because they have some type of experience that is going to be, they'll be able to tolerate their lives for whatever reason, pain, aggravation, those kind of things. If they have that, our congregation is going to make rules that say, well, they can have THC before services, but only for this reason or only this amount. And I think that we're now in a gray area where people would have said, well, we're going to let people take whatever medication that they needed, any pharmaceuticals that they needed. But what about marijuana? So I do think that this is going to be an issue for the future. I don't know if it's been discussed many times yet, but there's no prohibition for a rabbi to have alcohol before services. I didn't say that. But there is definitely a prohibition, one would say, of being intoxicated. So these are some issues for the future. I will not, hopefully during my rabbinical personal experiences, will not have to deal with this. But, and people know I'm very honest and upfront, and I don't keep, my private life really that guarded. But I hope, and I don't intend to have to make this an issue that is an issue for myself. But it will be an issue, and it could very well be an issue for the future. So again, I'm not making any comments on it one way or the other, but I will tell you that it may very well be an issue where synagogues will have to say, look, when you're, we'll say you don't drink, but what about what other medications or prescriptions, or again, what types of intoxicants that people are going to use in order to, stay even keeled, and what is the fine line there? So I will say that this is involved in this, and this is what we have in the Midrash on Nadav and Avihu. The very last line that we read again kind of goes back to, this is more of the, but they're really good people. They were pious, and this is kind of the rabbinic tradition of kind of synthesizing these things, which was they were very prideful, they were very arrogant, but they were pious. And this is, again, maybe something you'd say, well, what difference does it make if they were pious? The rabbis say no. God does not want to see a pious father lose their sons no matter what. So Aaron, it was difficult for Aaron to suffer just because of who Aaron was. But the Midrash goes further and says, yes, but they were pious too. And even when someone's pious and has these horrible character flaws, it's a tremendous tragedy when someone's pious and dies. So we have that. All right. A little bit more about Nadav and Avihu. But this paragraph got some interesting traditions about Aaron and the repercussions of the death.
When Aaron heard of the death of his sons, he said, "All Israel saw you at the Red Sea as well as at Sinai without suffering injury thereafter. But my sons, whom you ordered to dwell in the tabernacle, a place that a layman may not enter without being punished by death, my sons entered the tabernacle to behold your strength and your might, and they died." God hereupon said to Moses, "Tell Aaron the following: I have shown you great favor and have granted you great honor through this, that your sons have been burnt. I assigned to you and your sons a place nearer to the sanctuary, before all others, even your brother Moses. But I have also decreed that whosoever enters the tabernacle without having been commanded, he shall be stricken with leprosy. Would you have wished your sons, to whom the innermost places had been assigned, to sit as lepers outside the encampment as a penalty for having entered the Holy of Holies?" When Moses imparted these words to his brother, Aaron said, "I thank you, O God, for that which you have shown me in causing my sons to die rather than having them waste their lives as lepers. It behooves me to thank you and praise you because your loving kindness is better than life. my lips shall praise you.
Oh, wow.
I don't like that one.
What to say about that? Yeah, Rosemary, what were you gonna say? What do you say about that?
I just don't like it. I mean,
So what?
especially,
So,
I mean, for my particular situation where, I'm trying to adjust to a different kind of life, having to say, well, maybe you'd be better off dead. That's not helpful to me right now.
well, what's so strange about it is that um, there is an interesting, there is an
Not
interesting.
nice to lepers either.
Well, yeah, but back in those days,
Right.
it was a horrible death, long death sentence, and one that you couldn't see your kids anymore. You
Mhm.
know that they were lingering and suffering and pain. So this is the point. There is an incurable, horrible disease that wastes away the body until again, it's just horrific. It's like the worst death in those days, in the sense that it was the longest, most painful, and drawn out, excruciating death. And your family couldn't even see you. You couldn't be around you because you were quarantined. So what this essentially is saying is that that's the way they should have died. They should have died as lepers. But I took them instantly. I killed them immediately. Again, all of this, well, let's finish this idea first. Because essentially, they could have had a long, lingering death, and I killed them immediately. I did you a favor. Because these are the rules. This is the system. There's no getting around the system, by the way. System is the system. It's in place. You're following it. They're following it. It's going to keep your family in business. They're going to be a big part of the system. So they have to play by the rules. You have to play by the rules. But because of that, the punishment is so great. And their punishment was going to be horrific. And so I helped you with this. I gave you a break. It is also almost Godfather like from the standpoint of saying, look, this was their punishment. They had to be punished. I had to make an example of them. But I killed them quick. I didn't torture them. I didn't, it could have been a lot worse. I took them out quick. And it's scary. And again, for us, by our measures of, this is not the way we want to hear God talking. Because these are God's rules, but the system is the system. The rules have to be followed. And so between leprosy and dying like this, thank you, God, for doing this. But it gets to this issue that people do face, which is it better to have a long drawn out illness, or is it better to be taken quick? And the rabbis definitely will, in many places, say having a long lingering death is the worst thing that can happen. The worst way to die. You're all going to die. The long lingering death is the worst way to die. And especially a long lingering death where no one ever gets to see you. The people who love you and care for you don't get to even hug you or be near you when you die. That is the worst. So there's that. And again, so the system being what it is, does anybody have to die? It's another issue, which the rabbis also entertain. They say they put in Aaron's mouth, God, everybody saw you at the Red Sea. Everybody. My sons didn't do anything that everyone else hasn't done already, which is just try to come close to you. And so Aaron makes that point saying, what did they do that was that bad? Why? It doesn't make sense. And God's answer to that essentially is because there's a time and place for it, and they broke the rule. And the rule has to be consistent and it has to be enforced, which is why they had to die. And the way they died was much quicker and less painful than the way it should have been. In which case, Aaron says, "Thank you, God, for taking my son so quick," which is a much different answer or a much different response than we maybe would want to have Aaron say and how we want him to react. Because what the Torah tells us is that Aaron was silent. We saw that when we look back at Leviticus. Aaron was silent. So why was Aaron silent? Because he knows that this is what has to be. And according to the Midrash, it could have been much, much worse. And so Aaron, in this Midrash, even goes so far as to say, "I praise you, God." Which is actually him saying something, but he doesn't say it maybe out loud in front of anybody else. That, that's the way Aaron responded to this terrible loss. That's Aaron. Now, let's see what Moses does.
Moses endeavored to comfort his brother in still another way, saying, "Your sons died to glorify the name of the Lord. Blessed be his name. For on Sinai God said to me, and there will I meet with the children of Israel. The tabernacle shall be sanctified by those that glorify me." I knew that this sanctuary of God was to be sanctified by the death of those that stood near it. But I thought that either you or I was destined for this. But now I perceive that your sons were nearer to God than we. These last words sufficed to induce Aaron to control his grief over the loss of his sons. And like the true wise man, he silently bore the heavy blow of fate without murmur or lament. God rewarded him for his silence by addressing him directly and imparting an important priestly law to him.
Yeah.
I don't like that one either.
Yeah, this goes back to the line that Moses says in the Torah, which is this. Moses says, "This is."
I know they're glossing on Aaron was silent, but nowadays we don't think that's the healthy way to grieve.
Yeah, but here it appears that at least the rabbis say he was trying to do it, not he was trying to comfort him, not make a statement of, well, that's the way it goes, because it could be read that way.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Let's just, I mean, the actual line is, "This is what the Lord meant when he said, through those near to me, I will show myself holy and gain glory before all the people." And Aaron was silent. So there seems to be a cause and effect between what happens in that line, or what, again, Moses says it and then Aaron's silent. So what had to have happened in Aaron is either it comforted him or it said something to him which made his response one of acceptance. And it does seem to be this idea that he comforts him by saying, your sons just proved what God is trying to do. Um, it's a strange and powerful and disturbing scene because Moses and Aaron are sitting there basically being uh, they're working together. I mean, they are the generation that was given this responsibility. They're passing um, they're passing it on to the next generation, and things have gone wrong even before they're out of business, out of their job. Uh, it just went off the rails. And I think there's this recognition that, well, maybe all of us, meaning all of us in leadership, part of what we do is through our experience teach people what to do and what not to do. And that's part of what we do as leaders. We show people and demonstrate to people through our lives how they should live. There's a recognition here that there's a mythic element to their lives. They recognize here to some extent those near to me, meaning us, Moses, Aaron, the kids, our kids. We are part of what makes God real. We're part of what makes God powerful and holy, and we prove God's existence essentially by the way we live and even the way we get punished. People are going to say, oh, wow, there is a God because Aaron's kids just got burned up. Or again, they're the examples. And we still do that. I mean, we still do that with our politicians. We still do that with our celebrities, that we want to see them essentially live large human experience, and in good times and bad times say, oh yeah, we all know that. Look what happened to them. Even them. Or I guess somebody had to be made an example of. And when the people don't follow those route, right, where something bad happens, something happens where people say, oh, that's not fair, they got away with it, that we are left with this feeling of injustice, heavy injustice, because if the rich and powerful don't get punished, then the system's flawed and the system's broken. So almost it gets proven when they get punished. And we feel that. I mean, we feel that especially with celebrities or politicians. I mean, the best examples of those are, again, when politicians fall from grace. I mean, this is one of the issues that people felt with Ted Kennedy and Chappaquiddick. I mean, that was a egregious situation of people feeling that, oh, that family was protected from tragedy or punishment or justice because of their power. Where on the other hand, when the oldest, Joe Kennedy, died during World War II, that's what families do in order to be leaders. They sacrifice their family members. They die because they are the best of us. So that is in one family an example of what happens with their lives being essentially a lesson, and the kind of the mythic proportion that people have by being who they, just by being born into that responsibility, which is what Nadav and Abihu are. They're born into this. So Aaron has to now mourn quietly, silently, because if he overreacts or reacts incorrectly, it's going to make things even worse. And if he publicly said what the Midrash says he said, which is, God, why did you do this to my kids? Everybody's seen you. Why? That would have sent the wrong message to everybody. So even if he wanted to say that, even if he said it internally, he doesn't say it out loud. So it gets even worse to some extent.
Aaron could not take part in the burial of Nadav and Abihu, for a high priest is not permitted to take part in a funeral procession, even if the deceased is a near kinsman. Eleazar and Itamar also, the surviving sons of Aaron, were not permitted to mourn or attend the funeral on the day of their dedication as priests, so that Aaron's cousins, the Levites Mishael and Elzaphan, the next of kin after these, had to attend to the funeral. These two Levites were the sons of a very worthy father, who was not only by descent a near kinsman of Aaron, but who was also closely akin to Aaron in character. As Aaron pursued peace, so did his uncle Uzziel, father to Mishael and Elzaphan. Being Levites, they might not enter the place where the heavenly fire had met their cousins. Hence, an angel had thrust Nadav and Abihu out of the priestly room, and they did not die until they were outside it, so that Mishael and Elzaphan might approach them.
So there's the logistical issue here, which is who took part in the burial? How were they buried? Well, the Torah tells us that their cousins, Levites, Mishael and Elzaphan, take part in the burial. They bury him because their brothers couldn't bury him, their father couldn't bury him. None of the priests could actually take part in the burial because they can't come in contact with a dead body, even their own kinsmen. So how do they do this? How do they take care of the dead body? Because they die in a place where only priests can go. The only priests are them. They're the only priests at this point. They can't get cousins or second, or I mean, they'd all be cousins, right? All priests are technically cousins, but there are no far enough away cousins at this point because the only priests are one family, in immediate family. There are no cousins. There's no extended family yet. So what do you do? Because the cousins are Levites, which is important. They're Levites. They're not priests. They can't go into the priestly area. Can't go by the Holy of Holies. They're not allowed in. So there's a logic problem here. There's a logic problem because you can't have a priest enter and none of the priests can enter, can't take part in burial. And the Torah is very clear about that. So what has to happen? We need an angel. We need angels. We need help. So what happens here is that an angel takes them out of the Holy of Holies area and takes their bodies to a place that they can now carry them, take them out, and bury them. So that's how they got around that logistical problem of how do you bury them, but how do you get to their bodies if you can't go into that area? So that's why you have the angels. So, or angel. So, very sad situation too, that the family can't come near the bodies. Part of what being a priest would be. Especially again, the high priests, the people would be the high priests, can't even come in contact with their own family members. So, coming to the end of the Nadav and Abihu story, but interesting little lesson here about how do you move on after death.
Whereas the whole house of Israel was bidden to bewail the death of Nadav and Abihu, for the death of a pious man is greater misfortune to Israel than the temples burning to ashes. Aaron and his sons, on the other hand, were permitted to take no share in the mourning, and Moses bade them eat of the parts of the offering due them as if nothing had happened. Now, when Moses saw that Aaron had burnt to ashes one of the 3 sin offerings that were offered on that day, without himself or his sons have partaken of it, his wrath was kindled against his brother. But in consideration of Aaron's age and his office, Moses addressed his violent words not to Aaron himself, but to his sons. He reproached them with having offended against God's commandment in burning one sin offering and eating of the other 2. He asked them besides if they were not wise enough to profit by the example of their deceased brothers who paid for their arbitrary actions with their lives, particularly since they also had been doomed to death and owed their lives only to his prayer, which had power to preserve for their father half the number of sons. Moses' reproof, however, was unjustified, for Aaron and his sons had done what the statutes required. But Moses had on this occasion, as on 2 others owing to his wrath, forgotten the laws which he himself had taught Israel. Hence, Aaron opposed him decidedly and pointed out his error to him. Moses, far from taking Aaron's reprimand amiss, caused a herald to make an announcement throughout the camp. I have falsely interpreted the law, and Aaron, my brother, has corrected me. Eleazar and Itamar also knew the law, but were silent out of consideration for me. As a reward for their considerateness, God thereupon revealed important laws to Moses with a special injunction to tell them to Aaron, as well as to Eleazar and Itamar.
Yep. So what goes on in that scene? Now, first of all, this is actually in the Torah. This is actually the end of chapter 11, which is that after this happens, after the bodies are taken out, and it says, Moses spoke to the remaining sons, Eleazar and Itamar, take the meal offering that's left over, etc. This is about eating holy things, which, again, assumedly, Moses says this because he wants to make sure, according to the Midrash, that business goes on as usual. Even though you've got this horrible loss, you've got business to do. You got to do your job. So what happens is, that's what Moses tells them. And then it says, Moses inquired about the goat of sin offering, and it had already been burned. And he was angry with Eleazar and Itamar, Aaron's remaining sons, and said, why did you not eat of the sin offering in the sacred area? For it is most holy, and it is given it to you. God has given it to you to remove the guilt of the community and to make expiation before the Lord. You're not doing it for yourself. It's not for you to eat and have a good meal. It's because doing this ritual helps the people be freed of their sin. You have to do this. Do it right. People are counting on you. Now, notice the rabbis point out that he's not mad at them. He's mad at Aaron, but he doesn't confront Aaron. He confronts his nephews instead. Okay, makes sense. It's human behavior. This is what happens after you suffered a tremendous loss. You don't want to confront the mourner, so you confront their family. Stuff happens all the time. It happens in this family. It happens in Moses-Aaron family. But it turns out that God, at least the way that God's commanded these sacrifices to be offered, Aaron didn't do anything wrong. Moses was wrong. Because Aaron says to Moses, again, Aaron responded, even though Moses had talked to Eleazar and Ithamar, see this day that they brought their sin offering and their burnt offering for the Lord, and such things have befallen me. Had I eaten the sin offering today, would the Lord have approved? So Moses is literally kind of challenged by Aaron in a way that Moses recognizes, oh yeah, I guess Aaron's right. And it says that Moses approved of it. Now the next line, the next paragraph, the next chapter, the next text has to do with chapter 11 with the laws of kashrut, what animals you can eat. So this seems to be the end of the narrative, the end of the story, if you will. So the last line is Moses approved, last words. So the rabbis go further to say that Moses actually sends out a message to everybody that I was wrong. I was wrong. The Midrash actually tells us that Moses does something that it's important for leaders to do, which is admit when they are wrong. It's not a sign of weakness to do that. Moses actually told everybody, I'm wrong. I made a bad judgment, a bad interpretation. Aaron's was right. And he was right, I was wrong. And he lets everybody know. And what was handled so beautifully by this is that Eleazar and Ithamar also don't challenge their uncle. They don't say to Moses, you're wrong. They don't. Aaron does. Aaron challenges his brother. They're on somewhat more equal footing. But because Eleazar and Ithamar didn't say anything, now again, you'd say, well, Aaron's the one to respond, but Moses challenged them. Moses didn't challenge Aaron. He challenged Eleazar and Ithamar. They had a right to respond. But just because you have a right to respond doesn't mean that you should, and doesn't mean that you are, again, showing the proper respect and deference to your senior by responding. They let their dad respond. They let their dad, in that dynamic of what happened, and the Torah just laid out what happened. Moses challenges Eleazar and Ithamar. Aaron responds. And what we know after that is that Eleazar and Ithamar then get included in proclamations. When God says something, we sometimes, not always, but afterwards, occasionally these guys get included with their father in the commandments. And so that's why they get that reward, is because of the deference that they showed to their uncle Moses. They knew it. They had a right to say it. It's not that they didn't know it. They knew it. It's not that they didn't have the right to do it. Moses challenged them, went to them. They don't, which shows, again, a high level of emotional intelligence, if you will, which is, again, it's sometimes a good idea to show the proper respect to your senior colleagues. It's a great lesson in the workplace, which is that it doesn't oftentimes ingratiate younger workers to challenge their senior colleagues. It's better to go through the proper channels and to have, a senior colleague represent you in those discussions. Just because you can, just because you have a right to do it, just because you have the capability of doing it, doesn't mean you should. And so Elazar and Itamar show a great deal of control and emotional intelligence, and letting it go up the chain of command to their father, which maybe is easier too when you know it's your father who's going to have your back. But I will tell you, it's a very interesting little episode in the Midrash. It's an interesting episode in the Torah, which you oftentimes forget is the last part of this story. But it is an interesting, further explored by the Midrash, that sometimes, again, just because you can do something, just because you're given an opportunity to do something, doesn't mean you should. So I love that little lesson there for how to work in a environment of how to deal with politics in the workplace. Sometimes also politics of the family. We're going to start this, but we're not going to get into this whole text right now. But I want to show you, because I was pretty sure we would get into this, though we're kind of at the end. This is like actually a natural place to break today. But I do want to have Rosemary show us what is about to happen in this collection of Midrash. Again, this is not every Midrash. This is not the only way to read Midrash. It's the way Ginsburg did it. And so we definitely give him lots of credit for organizing it in such a way that Jews around the world study Midrash through the legends of the Jews, through his original work in German, which was translated, as we've said, by Henrietta Zold, the founder of Hadassah, and a daughter of a rabbi and a very knowledgeable woman in her own right on traditional Jewish texts, German, English, knew many languages. Let's take a look at the next set of Midrashim, which, as I said, I just want to show you what happens here. Okay.
When Moses called on the people to make their offerings for the erection of the sanctuary, it sorely vexed the princes of the tribes that he had not summoned them particularly. Hence, they withheld their contributions, waiting for the people to give according to their powers, so that they might step in and make up the deficiency, and all should observe that without them the tabernacle could not have been completed. But they were mistaken, for in their ready devotion the people provided all needful things for the sanctuary. And when the princes of the tribes perceived their mistake and brought their contributions, it was too late.
Okay, so pause right there. That's where we're going to finish today. And I want to tell you what's interesting about this is that, in case you forgot this story, and again, it's very forgettable. Don't want to say that. It's not the most memorable part of the Torah. I should never say it's the most forgettable, but it's not the most memorable part of the Torah. There is a line, or not a line, it's not right. There is a section of the Torah that deals with the gifts of the tribes. And I will show you where it is, because I do have the Torah right here with us. So here's the part of the Torah that we just read. Moses approves. That's the end of chapter 10. As we mentioned, Shmini gets into the laws of kashrut. And then after kashrut in chapter 11, we get into Tazria Mitzorah, laws of leprosy. Very important job the priests have is to medically evaluate and then diagnose and quarantine people. Tazria Mitzorah. Started getting into what the priests do as a job. That's Tazria. That's Mitzorah. Scaly affections, menstruation, blood. Good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah. Clean and unclean. We just read this a few months ago. So for people who are there Wednesday nights, you know what we're skipping over right now. Then we get into Achrei Mot, which are the laws of the priests. And it specifically talks about after the death of the two sons of Aaron. That's what Achrei Mot means. This is the section we read at Yom Kippur, which deals with how the people would now re-sanctify the tabernacle. We will come back to this a little bit, in a way. Then we get into what's called the Holiness Code. This is starts here, a little bit further. Here we go. I am the Lord your God. You shall not copy the practices of the land of Egypt. And what we have there are laws of not to marry people that we shouldn't be marrying, again, by most Western standards. Kedoshim, which is all about being holy. I, the Lord, am your holy. This is most definitely the holiness code. Some people say the holiness code actually begins here. I think it begins actually before that at the Achrei Mot. I mean, I'm not the only person who thinks that, but again, you could also make the argument that even Tazria Mitzorah, or how to be holy, how to be healthy. And this is now Leviticus chapter 19, laws about how to live your life. Of course, here we have the famous line of against homosexuality, all part of the holiness code. Again, many people say it's linked to the practices of the Canaanites that the holiness code kind of begins with. Don't behave like the Canaanites. We get into more lines about holidays. Again, things that we're supposed to eat, not eat, sacrifices. These are the fixed times. This is all about different holidays and offering up sacrifices on those days. Then we get into, this is Sukkot, holidays. Then we get into Bahar B'chukotai. The last two chapters, or excuse me, the last two portions, Torah portions, which go from Leviticus chapter 25 all the way to the end of Leviticus, which is the shortest book of the five. 25, 26, 27. Bahar B'chukotai are so short that they're oftentimes read as a one portion. Sorry, 25, 26, and 27. Yeah. B'chukotai starts at went too far, right there, right towards the beginning of chapter 26. So those are the last portions of Leviticus, and that's it. That's Leviticus. So then, when we go to the next book of the Bible, we're in the book of Numbers, and the first parts of the book of Numbers are the census. Not a lot of midrash on that. But we get to chapter 7 of Numbers, which is interesting because it begins with the words, on that day Moses finished setting up the tabernacle. He anointed and consecrated all its furnishings as well as the altar and its utensils, where he had anointed and consecrated it. This takes us back in Numbers to what we just read about the dedication week. Now again, it is simple to say it's written by different authors. And so it goes back in chapter 7 to this moment, or to the week before, to the day that Moses actually, remember, Moses dedicates it, read about that in the Midrash, and then turns it over to everybody else. But it's in chapter 7 of Numbers that we get this interesting text that we just read, by the way. If literally 3 weeks ago, we read this, 4 weeks ago, sorry. We read about, it says right here, the chiefs of Israel, the heads of the ancestral houses, the chieftains of the tribes, those in charge of the enrollment, drew near, and they brought their offering before the Lord. 6 draft carts and 12 oxen, a cart for every chieftain and an ox for each one, when they had brought them before the tabernacle. And we have this wonderful chapter, chapter 7, when we get to this portion, and we did recently. It's a really, really, really long chapter. As a matter of fact, as we talked about a few weeks ago, for those who were there on Wednesday night, it's the longest chapter in the whole Torah. Anyone asks, what's the longest chapter in the Torah? Those who are in our class and those who know me well enough will tell you it's Naso. It's chapter 7 of Naso, which goes on for 89 verses. And essentially, it's the gifts of the tribes, that each chieftain brings forward the same offering. And we just read it. On the 12th day, the last one, it's the tribe of Naphtali. Every day they bring the same thing. 1 silver bowl weighing 130 shekels, 1 silver basin of 70 shekels. And by the way, I'm reading it the way we read it after we've read 12 times of the same thing. By the sanctuary way, both filled with choice flour and oil mixed in for a meal offering. The interesting thing is the Midrash says, why now? Why do the chieftains do this? Why do we have this in the Torah? And the rabbis actually come up with a really interesting thing that Rosemary just read, which is they don't like the fact that everybody else brought everything. They didn't have to do anything. And so the chapter actually begins with the words, I went all the way to the beginning of Numbers. When you go to the beginning of chapter 7, it says, again, the chieftains of Israel, the heads of their houses, ancestral houses, namely the chiefs of the tribes, those in charge of the enrollment, drew near. Why are they coming now? And why does it go over and over again that they're the chief of the tribes? It's because, as the Midrash hints, and as we'll read next week, they're a little bent out of shape. We're the chiefs. You didn't need our stuff? Yeah. They don't like the fact that Mishkan gets finished without them. So they held back. They didn't bring anything. They want to prove their necessity. And when they are proven that they're not needed, they realize they screwed up. They missed an opportunity as the leaders to do something special. So they do it now. And that's why the rabbis have this weird connection to, well, why does this happen in Numbers chapter 7? Why does it happen now? Why do we get this interesting text from Numbers chapter 7, which seems so out of place? It doesn't seem to go here because they screwed up. The chiefs screwed up. And so we're going to read about this next week, the gifts of the princes. This text, very much like the chapter that it comes from, is quite long. And so next week we're going to read, and I think we'll probably read it. We'll see if we can read it all next week. But basically what it does is it goes through each gift. And again, I don't want to ruin it for next week. You've got to come back next week. We're going to read about how the rabbis interpreted these gifts. Because I will tell you, it's very repetitious. It really is. It is arguably the most repetitious because of the length and the sheer repetitiveness of saying that each chief brought the same gift. But I will tell you this, that the rabbis derive from this, that even though they're giving the same gift, each gift was different. that each one of the gifts, as we're going to read, each one was reflective of that tribe. What happened to that tribe and what's going to happen to that tribe. And so we have an interesting midrash on the tribes, each one of the 12 tribes. So we'll read that next week. And I hope you're all with us, and I hope you all join us. And of course, we got a lot to do between then and now. We have Wednesday night class tomorrow night. We of course have we'll be doing a Shabbat service before the 4th, and we will also have the 4th of July, a chance for us to celebrate our country and to hopefully not offer up any sacred fire, unwarranted and unlawful sacred fire. What a perfect time to read this midrash, and for me to just get into a very, very special warning. Please don't get hurt on the 4th of July. And not with fireworks or with any other elements of fire or anything else that is the alien fire. You say, I was just trying to celebrate our country, like Nadav and Avihu, just trying to do the right thing. No, don't do it. You can get arrested. You can start a fire. You can hurt yourself. And we don't want anyone to hurt yourself. And don't go out and visit Rosemary and buy fireworks out in Fillmore. I know they want you to, but
We in Santa Paula are not generally very happy about Fillmore's fireworks.
because it creates a terrible traffic jam.
It creates a terrible traffic jam. And if the Santa Ana's blowing and there's a fire that starts at Fillmore, guess where it's going to go?
I'm only laughing because you're a neighbor. You're a neighbor to that craziness that happens out in Fillmore.
It's not my fault.
Well, anyways, stay safe, everybody. Stay good. And again, wishing everybody a very happy 4th of July. And again, what can we say? We're very lucky to live in this country where people do crazy stuff. They have the right to do crazy stuff. They shouldn't do crazy stuff, but they do have the right. And but be careful, everybody. Thanks, Rosemary, for reading, and thanks everybody for being here. And again, it's good seeing everybody. Stay cool. I will do my part.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.